what word comes to mind when you think of Bosnia and Herzegovina?
Beauty.
Bosnia is a beautiful country, but a complicated state.
Katastrofalna.
It's a beautiful country with a lot of problems.
U srpskoj Srebrenici.
Šta još dalje vas iznenađuje u Bosni i Hercegovini?
Svaki dan ovo iznenađenje.
Ne iznenađuje me ništa. Bosna i Hercegovina je država apsurda.
The fact that people haven't revolted against everybody in power.
That's an interesting question. Let me think for a second.
That's impossible to just explain in one sentence.
Life imprisonment.
The country is a too serious thing to be left to the politicians.
Czy w Bośni jest bezpiecznie? To jest jedno z tych pytań, które dosyć często padają.
Every now and then, I still get asked whether it's safe to travel, to work in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
To jest ciekawe, bo od konfliktu w tym kraju...
It's interesting because the war in Bosnia ended 30 years ago in 1995. But I think for many people, this country is still associated with that conflict. Perhaps because until recently, it was the last such brutal, major conflict in Europe after World War II.
Rozpad Jugosławii rozpoczął się w 1000...
The breakup of Yugoslavia began in 1991, and in some republics it was relatively peaceful, but not in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Elity polityczne wielonarodowej Bośni i Hercegowiny miały
The political elites of multi-ethnic Bosnia and Herzegovina had divergent visions for the future of their nations: the Bosniaks, Bosnian Serbs, and Bosnian Croats. The direct spark for the conflict was a referendum on the country's independence, boycotted by the Bosnian Serbs. They favored remaining in Yugoslavia or creating a separate Serbian entity outside Bosnia and Herzegovina. An exceptionally brutal war broke out, in which 100,000 people died, and about half of the country's population was forced to flee. Its tragic epilogue was the genocide in Srebrenica.
Epilogiem tej wojny było ludobójstwo w Srebrenicy. Srebrenica była jedną z 6 bośniackich enklaw, w których...
Srebrenica was one of 6 Bosnian enclaves, so-called safe zones, where protection of the population was supposed to be ensured by a Dutch battalion of UN peacekeeping forces stationed there. People counted on this battalion to protect them, but that didn't happen.
Holenderski batalion ich ochroni. Tak się jednak nie stało. Srebrenica była oblegana przez siły bośniackich Serbów dowodzone przez generała.
From early July, Srebrenica was besieged by Bosnian Serb forces, commanded by General Ratko Mladic. And on July 11, 1995, they captured the city. There are very well-known recordings and speeches by Ratko Mladic himself from this moment.
Evo nas 11. jula 1995. godine u srpskoj Srebrenici. Uoči još jednog velikoga praznika srpskoga, poklanjamo srpskome narodu.
Obiecuje, że ludność...
He promises that civilians will not suffer.
Ne bojte se ništa.
Część osób schroniła się w pobliskich...
Thousands of people flee to the UN base in Potocari, hoping for protection from the Blue Helmet soldiers. Some men try to break through on foot in the so-called Great March, escaping from this besieged zone to territories controlled by the Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Meanwhile, negotiations were taking place between the Dutch battalion commander and General Ratko Mladic. They were unsuccessful, and the Dutch colonel hands over the population that had gathered around this base. The Serbs begin separating the women and children from the men. Women and children are transported outside the base to the Bosnian zone, while the men are executed. The first mass executions begin, and they last for several days. Over 8,000 Muslim men and boys were killed in Srebrenica. The bodies of murdered Bosniaks were buried in mass graves, which were later relocated en masse. The Bosnian Serbs realized this could shock public opinion, so they tried to hide and mask the traces of their crimes.
Srebrenica wydarzyła się 11 lipca 1995 roku.
Srebrenica happened on July 11, 1995. A month later, Bosnian Serbs attacked the Markale marketplace in Sarajevo, where many people were also killed. These are the events that led to the culminating point where the international community, mainly the United States, decided on armed intervention, an air intervention attacking Bosnian Serb positions. These shifts on the front line succeeded in bringing the conflicting parties to the negotiation table, and these negotiations lasted for 3 weeks at an American base in Dayton, Ohio in the US.
Do rozmów negocjacyjnych, które trwały przez 3 tygodnie właśnie w amerykańskiej bazie w Dayton.
The Dayton Peace Agreement was established on November 21st and formally signed on December 14th, 1995.
On behalf of all of us who would come to see this peace take hold, you have seen what war has wrought. You know what peace can bring. Seize this chance and make it work.
At the time when Dayton was signed, nobody expected it's going to last. The country, of course, needed the peace agreement. It was 4 years of bloodshedding war, and it was welcomed by the citizens. But even those that actually participated in the Dayton, that signed the Dayton Agreement, did not expect it's going to last.
I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that when the Dayton Agreement was negotiated and agreed in the autumn of 1995, the main interest was in ending the war, ending a 3.5-year war that had killed 100,000 people, displaced half the population, and had enabled war crimes across the board. And that was the focus. During the negotiations, there was a mix of trying to put together a ceasefire, a peace deal, and also the blueprint for a state. And the element of the blueprint for a state was what was unique and reflected the time period of being in the mid-1990s, when there was a belief in the idea of liberal democracy, comprehensive security, and trying to create a framework for a peaceful future for a country in Europe that was seen as having a European perspective, a transatlantic perspective, membership in the European Union, Council of Europe, OSCE, NATO, etc. So it wasn't enough to just separate the warring parties and put up roadblocks. The idea was how to sort of rebuild a country that had been forcefully and very intentionally torn apart by various interests, external and internal.
It's an old phrase that we always, use here in Bosnia, and also when you talked with the internationals. So it basically brought peace. We have 30 years of peace, of lasting peace. But a frozen conflict.
It's a lasting peace. 30 years down the road, we are still living under the Dayton Peace Accord, which is a significance on its own because this is the longest peace agreement ever made. That's the significance of Dayton.
Układ z Dayton miał na celu przede wszystkim zakończenie wojny.
The Dayton Peace Agreement ended military operations between the warring parties, this hot phase of the conflict. Yet equally important, however, was its civilian part, which consisted of several elements that gave Bosnia and Herzegovina its specific institutional order that remains in effect today. One of the most important provisions was imposing a constitution, a document that is still considered controversial. A constitution that was never passed by parliament nor approved in a referendum, and is written in English. Dayton also established the country's administrative structure, which is quite complicated. It created two separate entities, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the unitary and highly centralized Republika Srpska, as well as a special area, the Brčko district. It is a strategically located autonomous unit which divides Republika Srpska into two parts. To make things interesting, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina itself is divided into 10 cantons, each with legislative and executive powers. Dayton also ensured the right of return for refugees and internally displaced persons, which was extremely important. And finally, this agreement assumed significant participation from the international community in the process of implementing its provisions. On the one hand, this was cooperation with the United Nations and NATO, but above all, a specific type of supervision of the international community was created, represented to this day by the Office of the High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina, with broad legislative and executive powers. Over the years, however, the office's importance has shifted, depending on the incumbent's engagement and international backing.
We come back to the origins. It was about allocation of power. It wasn't about the nature of government. Dayton's not a social contract. It's a warlord contract. It was an agreement around whatever you could get the people who had the weapons to agree to, in the hope that in the fullness of time it would evolve in a more democratic direction or be replaced with something else, though that was not made explicit in 1995, and the first serious attempt to revisit the Constitution only happened a decade later. If you're a Bosnian of whatever self-identification, Serb, Croat, Bosniak, other, call yourself Bosnian or Herzegovinian, this is a terrible system of government and it doesn't serve you. For the people, the actual citizenry, it's lousy. I'd say it's very effective for the people who hold power.
It's not a perfect arrangement, but as is often the case with temporary solutions, they are very durable. The Dayton Agreement cemented what this country looks like today, with its advantages and disadvantages. It's a big source of recurring crises, disputes, and problems at nearly every level of Bosnia and Herzegovina's functioning, both in politics and in the lives of ordinary people. And if we look closely at these specific situations and problems, we'll be able to better understand this country today, 30 years after the war.
Pierwszym problemem w Bośni i Hercegowinie już pojawia się na
Problems begin already at the level of statistics and census data. The last census was conducted in 2013, but its results were not universally accepted. However, according to this latest data, Bosnia and Herzegovina is 50.1% inhabited by Bosniaks, 15.4% by Croats, and 30.8% by Serbs. And we see that these are not 100% ethnically homogeneous areas. For example, Bosniaks live in Republika Srpska and vice versa. These data are important for another reason. Only these three groups have the status of so-called constitutive peoples, who have a central role in the political system. And, as we'll see, those others who don't declare themselves as Bosniaks, Croats, or Serbs are systematically discriminated against.
Systemowo dyskryminowani. Następnym źródłem problemów jest sam system władzy w tym kraju.
Another important outcome of Dayton is the system of government in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is one of the most complicated such arrangements in the world. There are three levels of government. The central level authorities have rather limited powers. They make decisions on foreign policy and security, fiscal budgetary matters, and the judiciary. Most powers important for citizens' daily lives, including education, healthcare, and infrastructure, are exercised by governments at the entity or cantonal level. At the entity level, and an entity is a word created specifically for Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have on the one hand the authorities of Republika Srpska, and on the other hand the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. However, these entities are not symmetrical. Republika Srpska is highly centralized, while the Federation is highly decentralized, consisting of 10 cantons that also have their legislative and executive powers. Besides the fact that this Byzantine administration is very expensive, in practice, various decisions can get stuck at different levels of this system, which definitely makes the daily lives of citizens very, very difficult.
This is the country of about 3 million people, which is divided into 2 entities, 1 district, and then within 1 entity, within the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, 10 cantons, which all actually behave and are set as states on its own. So in each of these administrative units, you have the full government in place, which basically means that we have 13 different ministries of health, which do not correspond with one another. There is no subordination set up by the Dayton. So the state-level law does not necessarily harmonize directly with the lower administrative units, and that creates a very significant burden on the life of citizens. I live in Sarajevo Canton. My health care is paid in the Sarajevo Canton, but I cannot go in the next canton, and I cannot go in Republika Srpska and seek medical care because I'm just residing in Sarajevo Canton and have the health care provided only within the canton boundaries. The same goes for the citizens of Republika Srpska. East Sarajevo is a part of Sarajevo. It's just divided administratively between 2 entities. But citizens of East Sarajevo have to seek more severe health assistance in Banja Luka, which is about 200 kilometers away. They cannot come to Sarajevo, which is about 10 minutes away. They have to go to Banja Luka, which is about 4 to 5 hours, depending on the road conditions. That's the reality of Bosnian everyday life for the citizens who are not necessarily to be blamed for the situation.
Źródłem problemów w Bośni i Hercegowinie.
The constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina is also a source of political and social disputes. Among its most important provisions, we find issues regarding territorial autonomy, ethnic parity, and the possibility of using a veto to defend the interests of a given people. And today's political elites still refer to these provisions. Autonomy refers to the division into entities and associated limits of exercising power. Ethnic parity means that in offices or government bodies, there's a requirement for the representation of the 3 constitutive peoples: Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs. Each ethnic group has guaranteed seats in parliaments or governments. And I'll repeat that this is a discriminating factor against people who don't declare themselves as one of these 3 ethnic groups. An example of how this works in practice is the House of Peoples of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which consists of 15 people. It must include exactly 5 representatives of each constitutive peoples. And they're not elected in direct elections, but by entity parliaments. And while the reason for creating ethnic parities was meant to ensure representation for each ethnic group, in practice it causes a paralysis of these institutions.
Kod nas je Ustav oktroisan.
We had our constitution imposed on us. It is not an expression of the will of the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I doubt that if we held a referendum today, the Dayton Constitution would receive support from our citizens. And the problem with it is participation. The Dayton Constitution, due to the compromises made in Dayton, introduced ethnic affiliation as an inevitable element. This ethnic affiliation obviously had good intentions. It was meant to ease relations between these 3 dominant ethnic communities. However, it forgot that about 20 ethnic communities live in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and according to the 2013 census, I think there are over 20, but let's not split hairs over this.
Preko 20, da sad ne licitiramo broj. I u tom pogledu date njima prednost. I to se po Daytonskom ustavu zove konstituent.
And in this regard, the Dayton Constitution gave the constituent peoples an advantage. We won't find constituent peoples in any constitution of any European country. Their participation in governance is visible in how Dayton limited passive electoral rights only to those constituent peoples. Only they can run for office. These are Bosniaks, Serbs and Croats. No other citizens like Jews or Roma can run. In Bosnia and Herzegovina we have, let's say, Slovenians, Italians, Albanians, Montenegrins, Macedonians, Germans, Ukrainians, Ruthenians, and I could go on. But the only ones who count are those three. When we talk about multi-ethnic countries, I think all countries in Europe are more or less multi-ethnic. What's a good example? Germany is certainly a multi-ethnic country. Austria is a multi-ethnic country. France is a multi-ethnic country. And they are all Germans, French, Italians, Poles. In these countries, ethnic communities participate as citizens in the political system of their country. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, an illusion is created that peoples are bearers of sovereignty. That's impossible. Impossible in theory, not just in practice.
Teorijski nemoguće. Ne postoji praksa takva.
Weto w obronie żywotnych interesów.
And finally, the Constitution contains provisions for the so-called mechanism of a vital interest of a Bosniak, Croat, or Serb people. It assumes that each representative of these three peoples has the right to protect their fundamental interest and can object to actions they consider harmful to their ethnic group. In practice, this means vetoing laws and again blocking action, and is used for various types of political struggle.
Do różnego rodzaju walki politycznej.
Kako to tvrdim?
How did this happen? The Dayton Peace Agreement introduced something called the protection of the vital interests of Bosniaks, Croats and Serbs, and not of all the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The constituent peoples can invoke this protection in any law, without restrictions. For example, we're passing an agricultural law. Someone can say that the vital interest, let's say of Croats, is threatened because, I don't know, Croats don't have enough tractors. This is impossible, but it's used to such an extent that even gambling, betting shops have some vital interest for one of the constituent peoples, which is untrue and impossible. So these blocking elements built into the Dayton Constitution are used to achieve the individual goals of ethnically organized parties that try to keep the country ethnically divided. Any country that experiences such ethnic division has no future. This inevitably leads to the disintegration of that country.
System w Bośni i Hercegowinie.
Bosnia and Herzegovina's political system is very expensive, complicated, inefficient, but despite everything, it persists. People live, they work, they vote, but this everyday life in the shadow of Dayton, these complications and limitations we've so far discussed directly translate into their quality of life.
Bosnia and Herzegovina today, 30 years after Dayton, seems more divided than ever. I have the impression that, unfortunately, if it depended on us and the people who live here, we wouldn't know how to stop the war. We cannot agree on what kind of peace we want in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
We are very much a divided country still. We are resurrecting this ethnic division that was the reason why we went into the war in the 90s. We are probably in the worst political situation now than we were ever since the war ended.
Zapravo Dayton za Srbe postao Biblija.
There was a moment when Dayton became something like a Bible for the Bosnian Serbs. They support Dayton, although many from the political elite, especially in the last 10 years, have in fact been acting against the provisions of Dayton, especially by insisting on the independence of Republika Srpska.
No one is happy about the Dayton Peace Agreement, and no one is actually able to reconcile these three different visions of how the political system should be actually reformed. Most of them know what they do not want, but they never actually explain or elaborate what they really want.
Bośni i Hercegowinie wszyscy są zgodni co do tego, że...
One thing everyone agrees on, however, is that the political system primarily benefits the political elites. They are adept at using it to gain personal benefits. And this is, of course, reflected in the condition of civil society and, simply put, the democratic rule of law.
Vi morate znati da trenutno ste u državi.
You need to know that you're currently in a country where 60% of the GDP is somehow created by politics. That is, it's under political control. If you want to succeed in business, you have to be in good relations with politicians to get some work done by the state, entity, or city. You have a situation where many politicians, almost all of them, are much richer after their mandate in politics than they would be if they ran some private company. Here, politics is a business. Politics controls everything, including most of the media. Unfortunately, public services are also under almost complete political control.
Well, it is hard to talk about democracy here because for a long time we are not a democratic country and we cannot talk about a democratic system for various reasons. We only have some kind of an illusion of democracy. We hold elections, we go out and vote. However, whether the election results actually reflect the decision of the people, that's questionable because the election system itself is rigged. We have massive election fraud happening every elections, in local, national elections, but also in terms of how the institutions that are supposed to ensure basic democratic standards, oversight, independent institutions are also completely captured by political parties and political elites.
In a divided system that provides an opportunity to entrench the rule of law by the clientelistic networks created by the political parties, corruption of course blooms. By all definitions of all relevant international reports, Bosnia and Herzegovina is recognized as a captured country. The difference between autocracies that we know in our neighborhood and Bosnia and Herzegovina is that we don't have the one person who is centralizing the power in himself, and it's usually he. We actually have a couple of them. And they use the territories that they control to absorb the resources and public funds. So corruption is actually vested in the political party leaders that are using the system, dividing the space within their own coalitions and basically use the funds and the public resources and basically anything within the territory that they control for their own benefit. We are talking about the billionaires created ever since the end of the war until now. They have privatized the public sector completely. Public procurement is one of the main sources, despite the reforms that we have actually been promoting for many years. Public procurement system is basically captured by the political parties through their proxies, through the companies that have direct links with the political parties. State resources, natural resources, concessions, everything is basically divided by the political parties. Political parties employ people into the public sector. They use the public sector, which is huge because of the administrative setup. It's a huge public sector, and the political parties are using public sector employees as a way to maintain in power because that's their guaranteed constituencies. They vote at the elections and they vote for the same party simply because they want to maintain the position. So overall, if you're not part of the system, that's how it's created, that if you're not part of the political system, if you don't have backing in the political parties, different political parties, of course, in different parts of the country, then you will not be able to accommodate any of your civic rights. And that's unfortunately the situation where people feel desperate that the system is possible to be changed.
W Bośni i Hercegowinie są osoby, które czują się dyskryminowane.
There are, of course, people in Bosnia and Herzegovina who feel discriminated against and try to change the system, questioning the current legislation and constitutional provisions. The most well-known example of systemic discrimination is the Sejdić-Finci case.
Možete biti rođeni u Bosni i Hercegovini, imati državljanstvo te zemlje, ali ako se ne izjašnjavate kao Bošnjak, Hrvat ili Srbin, u državno predsjedništvo nećete biti izabrani. Mjesta su rezervisana isključivo za konstitutivne narode.
Dervo Sejdić jest Roman.
Dervo Sejdić is Roma. Jakob Finci is Jewish. And both filed a complaint with the European Court of Human Rights that as people who are not members of one of the three constitutive peoples, they cannot run in elections for the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, that collective three-person head of state.
Na najwyższy urząd w państwie, czyli prezydium Bośni i Hercegowiny, która jest jakby kolektywną głową państwa. No i tutaj Europejski Trybunał Praw Człowieka w Strasburgu przyznał im rację, że faktycznie są systemowo.
The European Court of Human Rights confirmed they are discriminated against, but no changes followed. These would require political will, which currently doesn't exist in Bosnia and Herzegovina to do so. A similar example is the case of Slaven Kovacevic, who challenged the system of electing a member of the Bosnia and Herzegovina presidency because the election itself is discriminatory. Two representatives are elected from the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and one from Republika Srpska. And his case was also considered by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg.
A zašto mi ovdje u Bosni i Hercegovini biramo?
Why do we here in Bosnia and Herzegovina elect two people from the Federation and one from the other entity, Republika Srpska? This is not democracy. In this collective presidency, this trio should represent all citizens equally. They were not elected to represent peoples, but all citizens. How do I know this? From the Constitutional Court ruling from 1998. The Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina established this. So the question arises, why can't we all vote for three candidates and let the three best with the most votes become members of the presidency? We are not allowed to function like this, which is why I filed my case in Strasbourg. Let's put ourselves back in the situation of a person returning to Srebrenica. They survived genocide, survived the most terrible war crimes, but returned to their home and live in Srebrenica. Such a person has been forced, I deliberately use the word forced, for these 30 years in elections for presidency members to vote only for an ethnic Serb, knowing that all previous candidates who were ethnic Serbs had denial of genocide and glorification of war criminals built into their public policies. Why are people who survived genocide humiliated in this way? And this is one of the reasons why I went to Strasbourg, to try to remove from our constitution some elements from Dayton that are products of genocide and war crimes.
Izbaciti iz našeg ustava.
Problemem, z którym zmaga się dzisiejsza Bośnia i Hercegowina,
Threats of secession from leaders of Republika Srpska are yet another problem Bosnia and Herzegovina has been facing. For several years now, Milorad Dodik has been intensifying separatist rhetoric and taking actions aimed at overthrowing the constitutional order of the state and transforming Bosnia and Herzegovina de facto into a loose confederation. Milorad Dodik, who until recently was the president of Republika Srpska, is a politician who has learned how to use the possibilities of the current system to pursue his own interests and create political crises. He and his party, SNSD, the Alliance of Independent Social Democrats, have dominated political life in this entity, accumulating not just influence, but also wealth. Initially, Dodik was considered an alternative to very radical Bosnian Serbs right after the war. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's said that American tanks brought him to power. Madeleine Albright herself called him a breath of fresh air in the Balkans. He was supposed to be much more liberal, and indeed at first he was, but he very quickly understood how this system works. He intensified historical politics in Republika Srpska. He regularly questions what happened in Srebrenica, systematically fights against civil society, and openly questions the authority of the High Representative and other central body governments.
Pa on secesiju zagovara osamostaljivanje Republike Srpske.
Well, Dodik has been advocating for secession, for the independence of Republika Srpska since around 2006. They even organized referendums that were aimed towards the independence of Republika Srpska. Then he also talked about a plan for peaceful separation. But listening to Milorad Dodik, we sometimes hear quite contradictory information. On the issue of secession, or the threat of secession, he claims he is protecting the constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He doesn't recognize institutions that were created after the Dayton Peace Agreement, such as the prosecutor's office, the court, or some state agencies. He even passed a law suspending their operation on the territory of Republika Srpska. At the same time, he still went to this prosecutor's office, to court, and was part of the judicial process that was being conducted against him, only to keep saying again and again that the dream of this quasi-political elite from Republika Srpska is unification with Serbia. So I would say that he wants to secure his place in history by conducting politics that would lead to the unification of Serbs, that is, the unification of Republika Srpska with Serbia, which he has actually been pushing for lately along with Aleksandar Vučić. This is the idea of a Serbian world as a counterpart to the Russian world. But I think he is very aware that any independence of Republika Srpska from Bosnia and Herzegovina isn't possible, that it's not a realistic option. I think he's aware that right now there's still no international support for such an idea, and that is his main obstacle. However, with the rise of populism, with the rise of right-wing options also in Europe, he emphasizes that he is gaining more and more supporters of this idea.
Populizma, iako sa porastom desničarskih opcija kako u Evropi, on ističe kako dobija sve više pristalica za tu ideju.
Mi želimo i da kažemo jasno da nije nikakva iluzija, niti je kome pretnja, da Republika Srpska iskaže svoju volju, narodnu volju za formiranje svoje države, jer ne možemo da živimo u Bosni i Hercegovini koja nas ovako stiska i ugrožava naše slobode.
U prvom trenutku kada je Dodik pokrenuo tu ideju o samostaljenju,
There was a moment when Dodik announced this idea of Republika Srpska's independence, and he had many supporters among Serbs. But I also think a large portion of Serbs from Republika Srpska gained negative direct experience with Serbia. I say Serbia in quotation marks. Citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, regardless of whether they are Serbs, Croats, or Bosniaks, are always perceived in Serbia as, quote, stupid Bosnians. It doesn't matter if you're a Serb or belong to another ethnic community. To them, you are a Bosnian. And also today, many people in Serbia perceive Milorad Dodik as a Bosnian. And this is the biggest insult to him, when someone tells him that he's a Bosnian Serb. It's like pulling out a healthy tooth. This shows the level of contempt that he has for the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina.
to mi dođe kao da mi vadi zdrav zub. Znači, toliki prezir on iskazuje prema državi Bosni i Hercegovini.
Živjela Srbija! Živjela Republika Srpska! Živio srpski narod! Hvala!
Tokom vremena ljudi su ovdje vidjeli da...
Over time, people here have realized that in reality, he uses these secession plans as a kind of blackmail against the international community and domestic political actors in Bosnia and Herzegovina to get what he needs. And he usually gets it.
Da mu je potrebno i uglavnom je dobijao.
Nema tog udara ili muke koju nisam spreman da istrpim za Republiku Srpsku. Milorad Dodik će obavljati svoje poslove, putovati, ali nikada neće otići iz Republike Srpske. I ako neko misli da smo kukavice, grdno se prevari.
Znači on zagrmi, lupi šakom od sto i kaže...
The principle is this. He roars, bangs his fist on the table, says he will separate, make Republika Srpska independent, doesn't recognize the institutions of the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And of course, through the European Union's stabilocracy approach, they simply give in. And all his autocratic political tendencies are simply ignored.
And so he has continually used the rhetoric of secession. He has continually used his relationship with Belgrade to create more and more ties with Serbia. And he's continued to stop, block, and reverse many of these state-strengthening reforms that had been made up until that point. And to be honest, it makes complete sense for him to do this because there's no cost. He hasn't suffered any consequences from this. We've seen over the past year or two that there have started to be some threat of consequences, but he's always found a way to get around it.
Pa znate kako, ja sam svjestan u kom društvu se bavimo ovim poslom.
Well, you know I'm aware of what society I'm working in. I received my first serious death threat in 2003, and then the threats, pressure, injunctions continued. The last one was in February this year, when the indictment against Milorad Dodik was confirmed. Not far from here, a few hundred meters from our newsroom, he called me out, along with 2 other colleagues, for destroying Republika Srpska and called on people to deal with me. You know, when someone who is the most powerful politician in the country tells people to deal with you, it means he's removed the barrier for lunatics and said, do what you want with these people. The system allows it. It's very dangerous.
Računaju s vama, to znači da je ludacima digao rampu i rekao radite s ovim ljudima šta god hoćete. Sistem vam to dozvoljava. To je vrlo opasno. To je potez koji je toliko...
It's a move that is so evil and inhumane that it doesn't deserve any comment, but it actually confirms the need for media organizations like ours to exist, and this type of work, because imagine what it would be like if we didn't exist, if even these few voices that interpret the reality here differently didn't exist. So despite all this, I'm doing this work for myself, for my family, and I consider it important. We want a free society. We're in the 21st century and we won't live like in feudalism, where someone tells us what we can and cannot say.
Šta ne možemo da govorimo.
Društvo generalno kroz politiku podijeljeno na naše i njihove.
Here, society is generally divided by politics into ours and theirs. Ours means our media and our civil society, meaning those who support the current government. And the rest are the enemies. Bosnia and Herzegovina is presented in the public and media discourse as the abroad, as something with which Republika Srpska has nothing in common. These are our neighbors with whom we simply communicate, but from a certain distance.
Nema ništa. Znači, to su nama susjedi sa kojima mi tek tako komuniciramo, ali na jednoj određenoj distanci. Ovaj prostor je oduvijek bio veoma autoritaran. Znači, naše političko nasljeđe je...
This space has always been very authoritarian. That's why our political heritage is an authoritarian political culture, where citizens are predominantly good subjects and obedient people who nurture and build this cult of personality, cult of the leader. In everyday life, everyone sympathizes with Putin. Serbs love this cult of personality, this strong politician, autocrat, who governs in a forceful way. They very easily identify with these values. But on the other hand, no one goes to work in Russia. Everyone goes to Germany, that despised Germany, which here in the public narrative is compared to Nazi Germany.
Znači, svi oni odlaze u Njemačku, tu mrsku Njemačku, koja se ovdje u javnom narativu poredi sa nacističkom Njemačkom. Imali smo jedan veliki miting koji je organizovala aktualna vlast, na koju su došli...
We had a large rally organized by the current government, in which representatives of the highest authorities in Serbia also participated, where one of Dodik's coalition partners publicly regretted that when Russia attacked Ukraine, it didn't also attack and bomb Germany. These are the comparisons that are presented. If we're talking about the context of attitudes towards Russian aggression against Ukraine, there's actually a political position that has taken root among citizens, that Ukraine was rightfully attacked, that it was a special military operation, that Russia warned Ukraine that it couldn't become a NATO member, and they ignored it. Therefore, they deserved to be attacked in this way. Ordinary citizens accept this narrative. They don't think too much, they don't reflect on all these processes and events. And then what dictates this narrative is actually the current government, and it's an exclusively pro-Russian narrative.
I onda je ono što diktira taj narativ zapravo aktualna vlast, a taj narativ je isključivo proruski. Ovdje je vrlo zanimljivo da nekih investicija
What's very interesting, though, is that there has practically been no investment or financial and material aid from Russia. There was, however, a situation concerning a refinery in the town of Brod. It was a large complex that was privatized by the company Zarubiežneft. It was an opaque privatization, where we actually never discovered who was really behind it.
Nikada otkrili ko stoji zapravo iza te privatizacije i
And this refinery, privatized, operated, and in practice accumulated huge tax debts towards Republika Srpska. The Russian side, meaning this investor, never paid millions, hundreds of millions to the budget of Republika Srpska. And various oligarchs also appeared here. This is just an example of very non-transparent business transactions that always worked towards the detriment of Republika Srpska taxpayers.
Transparentnim poslovnim transakcijama i koje su uvijek išle na štetu poreskih obveznika iz Republike Srpske.
In light of all these considerations, I have decided to act.
Wysoki przedstawiciel ma swoje korzenie jeszcze w porozumieniu z Dayton.
The office of the High Representative is one of the most consequential roles anchored in the Dayton Peace Agreement. The international community assumed that at least in the initial years after the war, Bosnia and Herzegovina would need this advisory constitutional function and help in achieving consensus on controversial political and civic issues. And that was the purpose of establishing this office. It was meant to support the implementation of civilian agreements from Dayton. However, due to initial problems in building these institutions, in 1997 there was a decision to expand the powers of the Office of the High Representative, which today are truly impressive.
Dzisiaj są bardzo imponujące. Wysoki przedstawiciel na mocy tych uprawnień bońskich ma prawo zdymisjonować dowolnego polityka i urzędnika.
The OHR, under these bond powers, can, for example, dismiss any politician or official if they're breaking the law. He can introduce amendments to, for example, the criminal code. The OHR is not accountable to the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina and is not elected by them. He's chosen by the Peace Implementation Council, a collective body consisting of 55 countries. This body also determines how long the OHR's term lasts. It's definitely a unique institution on a global scale because it's a form of international supervision in an independent and sovereign state.
And I think that's what's a massive missed potential, is thinking that the High Representative was only there to maintain a status quo as opposed to build things forward. It's interesting to look at the Office of the High Representative, the OHR, from the beginning until now, to see how it started out being far, far weaker and disorganized and underfunded when compared to NATO, for example, to when it suddenly started to have a structure and funding, and even more importantly, tools and a vision, and a recognition that the person, the High Representative selected for this responsibility, could actually play a strong role in pushing an agenda. We saw this especially after the adoption of the bond powers, and we saw that Wolfgang Petritsch used this. We saw that Patty Ashdown used this quite efficiently. Things started to go downhill in terms of fulfilling the intended potential of the Office of the High Representative when Christian Schwarz-Schilling came in and started using language of partnership. And when he talked about partnership, it was never partnership with the people of this country. It was a partnership with the elites, who exactly at that same time started to want to roll back reforms. And after him, we saw Miroslav Lajcak, we saw Insko come in, and we suddenly got this weird sense of helplessness by these high reps who were like, boy, we just wish that there was someone who could do something about this, without recognizing that the only thing preventing them from trying to remedy and push back was their own lack of interest in doing so. And we've seen that the current High Representative Schmidt has been willing to use his powers in a way that basically is not helping the marginalized, is not helping the poor, is not helping the people, but is helping the nationalist parties to further pour into concrete an advantage that they don't necessarily deserve when you look at how citizens are satisfied and how they're not satisfied. When the book is written on this institution, that's going to be the story that's going to be told.
The Office of the High Representative, who's the final authority in theater for interpreting Dayton and enforcing it, has lost a lot of its credibility and luster. Obviously, if you're Milorad Dodik in Republika Srpska, you want it gone yesterday. So do the Russians, so do the Serbians. It's been hurt from all sides, and I think it's an essential tool. As long as you have Dayton, Bosnia and Herzegovina, this operating system for the state, you have to have a high representative. And you have to have an internationally credible military deterrent force. So long as there's Dayton, you have to have that. But we've never been clear that we understand that.
So is Bosnia and Herzegovina an independent state?
It is effectively, but it's got guardrails. It's an independent state with external enforcement mechanisms under an international peace treaty. I think that what you'd find is if you took those guardrails off formally, you would have a much bigger crisis than we've seen thus far. I don't buy that Bosnia's independence has been clipped by having these institutions. What it has done, though, it's made it easier for political elites to avoid things they don't want to do, but at the same time, they wouldn't have done them anyway. I think that's the ugly reality. What you're seeing now, and what you've seen since, I would argue, 2006. This is what Dayton is. Prior to then, you had Dayton under international pressure, Dayton with international enforcement. This is Dayton, Bosnia. This is what it would be without enforcement, effectively. If you take away those tools, I think it would be even worse. What's needed is a revisiting of why we got here. And a lot of that has been international mismanagement. And predominantly EU-led international mismanagement since 2006, because they've had the wheel.
The EU is a factor. The EU delegation here is a factor. Unfortunately, it's often seen as a factor that is ready to turn the blind eye to any of the problems in the country, as long as we are theoretically fulfilling the conditions toward the EU. That's the problem. I mean, the EU is kind of being observed as the tick the box exercise, where whatever you do, just finish what we need and move on with the process, which is wrong for the society. And it's a wrong even for the EU, because eventually we are, even if we fulfill all the conditions and become a member, we are going to be a problem for the EU.
Most politicians are not keen, to be honest, on joining the EU because it would hurt them at the end. But I would say it's still the only story in town. We got the candidate status, we waited a long time for the candidate status. But at the end, I mean, it also didn't bring much. To put it in a nutshell, the people don't feel it. That's a huge problem. They don't feel the funds coming in. I mean, this economic dimension is also not that visible. And politically, the EU doesn't manage to sell itself. And I think the EU, with internal problems, but also with problems outside, geopolitical problems, it still lacks a bit the capacity to deal with the region.
European Union initially was mainly engaged from post-Dayton as a donor. Then after 1999, with the Stability Pact, the door opened for both EU and NATO. That was formalized at Thessaloniki in 2003. The EU effectively took the baton from a greater American role around 2004 or 5. And at that point, the EU got complacent. I think it thought enlargement's going to solve everything. We don't need these hard power tools. We don't need enforcement mechanisms. The Americans were happy to let the EU lead, but there were frictions in the subsequent 20 years over how to use the tools that remain, whether to keep them, the Office of the High Representative and EUFOR. And we're still in that bind. You have two different flavors of bad. You have Americans that up until now have not wanted to revisit Dayton because they feel invested in it, and they don't want to invest more in strengthening things to make it changeable. The EU thinks, or at least pretends to think, that enlargement's going to solve this. I'm not sure how many people actually believe that anymore, but they have theological reasons to stick to that. And so you're in this dead zone. And in that dead zone is where the people who are the beneficiaries of the Dayton Peace Agreement, the political elites, play and take full advantage of it.
This country will not move forward towards the European Union with this current constitution. And one of the great ironies is that the European Union knows this itself. It's not like this is something new. So why is the European Union, I'm pointing because they're over there, why are they pretending that they can avoid constitutional reform in this country when they've expected of everyone else? Is it because they don't think anything is really going to happen? Is it because they don't believe the country will ever be a European Union member? Or is it because they just lack integrity and vision?
Everyone is more concerned into maintaining stability. We have, even when we talk about the approach of the international community, it's more focused on keeping this stabilocracy rather than actually making any kind of radical changes that might lead us in an unknown direction. When it comes to society, everyone is aware, in this country, of the problem of corruption, of the problem of the lack of accountability. People are dissatisfied, angry. They perfectly know what's happening because they see every day media articles, investigations of involvement of highest level public officials in corruption, the level of nepotism, the level of power that political families basically have in this country and control everything. However, at the same time, they feel powerless. They feel that they can't change anything. We did have, in a number of occasions, big protests happening around the country that lasted for months. Huge gatherings of people demanding accountability around different issues, and nothing gave specific results or concrete results.
If you talk to the ordinary citizens, they would be very much fed up with the politics. The politics becomes so dirty that people are like, we don't want to know. We are just do whatever you want with us. This apathy among the citizens is very often translated into lack of people voting. We have about 55% of people turning out to vote. Different nationalist ideas are driving people crazy simply because it's affecting the overall. We don't have a clear goal that people would be supportive of and be aimed toward. And that confusion is actually creating a sentiment of individual organization. So everybody individually are kind of organizing their life in order to survive. It's a survival mode that we pretty much all live. And again, we are in desperate need for the state support. The state take care of us rather than us individually finding a way through the chaos.
The state is fragile, and the peace is actually not that much fragile as long as we have these generations who actually remember the war. We have new generations here in the country who remember only this Dayton, Bosnia and Herzegovina, have only in their minds and actually awareness of a country that's deeply divided. They do not remember the pre-war Bosnia and Herzegovina and how the people lived, and etc., etc. They not remember the wars, besides the facts that they heard from their parents, but it's it's always one-sided view. The current generation, general, not only in Bosnia, but they have a lack of empathy because most of them live in this online world, and you cannot actually establish empathy towards anyone. As in the online world, you have to live with this real world, the offline world. And with such a new generation, with the political elites that never change their narrative, that's always populist or always attempting to actually rise the ethnic tensions, etc. I mean, the generations, they could actually make the peace fragile.
Ja mislim da jedino što nas sprečava
I think the only thing stopping us is that we don't have enough weapons. We don't have enough people who would fight. There aren't enough young people who have stayed. And that's actually a blessing in disguise.
I to je u stvari sreća u nesreći. Nesreća je što mladi ljudi ne vide budućnost.
The misfortune is that young people don't see a future in this country. The misfortune is that young people are perhaps afraid of some new conflict, and that's why they want to get as far away from here as possible. My nephew graduated from high school a few years ago here in Banja Luka. From his class, 2/3 of the students left Banja Luka and went abroad. So this is the picture. People are leaving. And I think that's the biggest problem, not only of our society here in Banja Luka, but of all of Bosnia and Herzegovina. These valuable young people don't see a possibility of getting along and don't see any possibility that the situation will calm down, that we could finally be some boring society in which we can live from our work, have fun, and discuss normal topics. If you look at the topics in our media, you get the impression that you're in the middle of a war. So it's no longer a matter of war itself. There definitely won't be one. I'm completely sure of that. But why do we have so much war in the public space? Because it's simpler to manipulate people with war than to solve problems.
Manipulacija ratom je jednostavnija od rješavanja problema.
Morat će, jer sadašnji politički sistem, nakon 30 godina,
something will have to change, because after 30 years, the current political system isn't working. I would point out the psychological elements behind it. It can implode, collapse in on itself. There's no need for a human factor here, because this agony with a political system that is uncertain has been going on for too long. And I'd say this. Many people are leaving Bosnia and Herzegovina. These aren't people who don't have work. Entire families are leaving, where both husband and wife have a job, and they're leaving for Western countries. And when you ask them why they left, if they have employment and a place to live, what's the problem? The lack of prospects. This political system offers no prospects. This political system leads to inevitable conflict. To prevent this, we must either change the political system or wait for a new conflict. I'm not a supporter of a new conflict. I would prefer to lean toward changing the political system, which is deviant and dysfunctional. A political system where you have competition between ethnic communities. Who is most important, more numerous, not numerous, who has a greater say in what areas, leads to new conflicts. Ethnic balance is a source of nationalism because ethnic communities competing will never admit that another ethnic community is equal to them. They will always present their ethnic community as better. When you have this kind of a political system, it leads to conflict. That's why it's very important that we change this ethnic system to a civic one, where all of us, 3 million of us living in Bosnia and Herzegovina, will be equal before the law, before the state institutions, and in everyday life.
I'm an angry optimist. I'm not. If I didn't believe that something better was possible here, I wouldn't be here. I genuinely think that there is a potential social contract among citizens of this country. I think that has potential traction, but that's never going to sell with the people who already hold power under the current system. So I could be very wrong in that presumption, but we will not find out unless we control the variables we can control from the outside, which is make clear to citizens that you don't need to be afraid. We are not going to let anything bad happen, but we're not going to fund your politicians. They're stealing from us and they're stealing from you. We'd have to be honest. I don't think we've been honest with ourselves or the citizens of this country about the dynamic that I think most international diplomats would openly tell you if a camera's not running what they think is actually happening. On the other end of the spectrum, I think you could limp along with, I think the default setting for the EU, but not just the EU, is treat Bosnia and Herzegovina as part of a cordon sanitaire toward the Western Balkans, make your deals with the people in power. You see this most clearly in Serbia. Throw money over the wall, mine what you can mine, park what migrants you could park there, and accept this country becoming an old folks home / refugee camp / toxic waste site. That's not a given. I don't even think it's a strategy, but I think that's the direction of travel if we continue on the path that we're on now. And then you have the Republika Srpska concept of, we've got ours, you guys in the Federation do whatever you want. I don't think that does anything positive for any people in this country if you don't already hold power. I don't think that that's going to lead to a flowering of democracy in each of the component parts. So I guess the real question is for the European Union, because they're going to be at least European citizens are going to be the audience for this in Poland, is what kind of southern border do you want the European Union to have? And do you want it to be part of a positive security equation or negative one? And what kind of values do you want reflected in your external relations? Because right now, these are values that, despite this country having an enlargement perspective, are not functionally dissimilar with the way we treat countries like Libya or Algeria or anything like that in the southern littoral, even though it's supposed to be able to join your club.
Bośnia i Hercegowina mogłaby być przykładem wieloetnicznego państwa w Europie.
Bosnia could be a prosperous country.
It can be a small, ecological, beautiful country with a huge tourist potential.
Bosna i Hercegovina mora biti moderna, demokratski uređena zemlja po evropskim standardima.
It can be even more beautiful and more successful if we behaved more accountable towards it.
It could be a country that fulfills the expectations of its citizens.
Mogla bi biti moderna, ali samo ako bude išla u pravcu Evropske unije.
It could be a well-functioning multi-ethnic country.